Welcome back. Another Democrat in the growing race for governor. Joel Brennan launching his campaign Thursday. The former Department of Administration secretary and most recently the president of the Greater Milwaukee Committee. Brennan joins former Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, who entered the race last week, current Lieutenant Governor Sarah Rodriguez, Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley, State Senator Kelda Roys, and State Representative Francesca Hong, and former WEDC CEO Missy Hughes. Joel Brennan joins us now. Joel, good to see you. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
We just read off the long list of candidates. It was a mouthful that are in the race. I'm curious, what is your lane in this race among all the other candidates?
Yeah, well, the thing I'm going, and by the way, I know all the candidates. We're all friends. I worked with many of them during the Evers administration. They're people I respect. And when you decide to do this, you don't decide to do it to run against anybody. You decide to do it because you're pursuing a job, and I think I have qualifications. The lane that I will pursue is the one that people are looking for executive experience. They're looking for people who, yes, get angry, but instead of wanting to get angry and get even, they want to get they're angry and they want to roll up their sleeves to get something done.
You were a top cabinet official under Governor Evers during COVID. In your launch video, you said that you stood up to the extremists during the pandemic. Who were those extremists?
Well, I think that you see a legislature here in Wisconsin, although they're extremists, but what they were oftentimes during COVID was invisible. They didn't meet for months on end during COVID, and what we had to do was to go out and provide direct support to small businesses, to farmers, to people who needed a roof over their head and needed housing. So, I'm very proud of the fact that Wisconsin led the way in a lot of those cases, and we found ways to be a government that could help, that could be there to help. Now, there are lots of people for very justifiable reasons that complain about government, and oftentimes there's lots to complain about. But during COVID was a time where government needed to stand up and needed to stand by the residents of Wisconsin, and that's what we did. There are all kinds of things that probably we could have done better if we had a playbook for how you deal with the worst public health crisis and economic crisis in 100 years. But we wrote our own playbook, and I like to think that we did a lot of things right during that time that helped get Wisconsin back on its feet.
I was going to say, would you have done anything differently in terms of the state's response?
If we had the chance to think and look at everything, of course we would do things differently. But the things I'm proud of is we led the way in the nation in terms of getting money to small businesses and putting hands directly into the hands of small businesses. We created opportunities for more than 20,000 family farms. We did things for people who were on the verge of losing their ability to have housing. Like, those were the things that we made. If there were challenges that we did during COVID, they were sins of commission rather than sins of omission. I think there were lots of people who would have stood back and said, well, let's wait and see. I don't think that that's something you can do during an emergency, and that's how the governor led, and that's how we, I think, tried to demonstrate we were on the side of people in Wisconsin.
There's been a lot of talk about tax plans among the Democratic candidates. I'm curious, under a Brennan administration, would taxes go up for Wisconsinites?
Oh, I'd like to make sure that we continue to do what we've done under the Evers administration, is to find ways to lower the tax burden for middle-class families. And I think that's been one of the hallmarks of what Tony Evers has been able to do. I think one of the things we have to do is find rational, reasonable ways to raise revenue in the state, but also direct that revenue and invest in things that we consider to be our Wisconsin values. For about a decade, there was true disinvestment in higher education and the UW system and the technical college system in Wisconsin. We need to make sure that whatever we're doing in terms of revenue, that we're able to invest in those important things that are part of Wisconsin's future and part of how do we get to be the place around innovation, around doing things first that Wisconsin has traditionally been, and we've backslid over the last 15 years under a Republican-dominated legislature.
Does that mean an increase for wealthy Wisconsinites and corporations?
I think it's an opportunity to look at everything. The first thing that the next governor is going to have to do is to put together a budget, and that's going to be one of the first things in the first weeks of a new administration. And I think those are value statements as much as they are policy statements. So as I get to work on day one, rolling up my sleeves, it's going to be around affordability issues. It's around how do we make sure that we're demonstrating that we're on the side of middle-class Wisconsin people.
Mandela Barnes, after launching his campaign last week within hours, essentially came out and said, listen, I'm going to work and campaign on repealing Act 10. Would you sign legislation if it came to your desk as governor?
I would. I think that's a demonstration of how we simply, we decided that, and this is what happens at the federal level now too. We decided to put target on the backs of public employees and on teachers, and I think now we're having challenges in finding people to fill those roles. They now have, for the better part of 10 years, had some real challenges that they've had to do. We have challenges in retaining and attracting people in those jobs. Yes, I would do that, but I also think that as we do that, we need to look at the relationship between state government and local government. We need to ensure that what we're doing in the contract that we have between state and local government that delivers really important, vital services to people, public safety, snow removal, all those types of things that happen at the local level, that we are doing what we can to ensure that those things are preserved in that relationship between state and local government.
I was going to say, no Act 10, though, result in even higher property taxes and more referendums for school districts?
Well, I think it all depends on how you end up doing this. You can't just saddle all of the responsibility of what's happening at the local level. There needs to be this level of partnership. And I think the work that happened over the last couple of years to increase state shared revenue, that was a step in the right direction. But you still, over the last, just in this year, I know of at least a half dozen communities who have gone to referendum to be able to create positions for firefighters.
Is this a campaign against President Trump?
I think it's a campaign to stand up to the cruelty, the challenges that Donald Trump provides, and what is, I think, chaos at the federal level. But I think every campaign is a campaign about Wisconsin. Is it about Donald Trump? Yes. Is it about standing for Wisconsin? Absolutely.
The newest Democratic candidate for governor, Joel Brennan. Joel, like always, thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
We've talked with all the candidates in the race, Democrat and Republican. You can watch all those interviews right now on the 12 News YouTube page. Just look for the Upfront playlist. Up next, the high-profile trial just hours away.